evening, everybody. For those of you who are just arriving, if you could go ahead and take your seats, and we are going to go ahead and get started. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce Daniel Diermeier, who serves as the 9th Chancellor of Vanderbilt University. As a political scientist, he's worked on theories of legislative institutions. He studied congressional committees in the U.S., and governing coalitions in multi-party democracies, and that makes him especially well-suited to introduce our guests tonight, Senators Mitch McConnell and Lamar Alexander. So please join me in welcoming Chancellor Diermeier.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for the kind introduction. Even mentioned some of my research, which was great to hear. I am so pleased to be with you tonight as we have two extraordinary guests, Senator McConnell and Senator Alexander. There's a whole bunch of senators today in the building. I want to do a little shout out to Senator Frist and Senator Corker, who are here with us as well, members of the Board of Trust. It's wonderful to see all of you. And I also thank our faculty, Professor John Meacham, John Geer, Professor Josh Klinchin, and Professor Nikki Hammer, of course, for leading the class this semester. And then I want to thank all of you, all of our students here, for your curiosity, your open-mindedness, your interest in how democracy really works, and your thoughtfulness and civility that you've displayed throughout the whole semester. You are now a vital part of the largest elective class ever in Vanderbilt's history. And you model for the world what a university should be. For those of you who don't know, but Senator Alexander was not only a senator, but of course he was governor of the state of Tennessee. He is a Vanderbilt alumnus. He was Secretary of Education, and he was also president of the University of Tennessee. And if you spot him, ask him which one was the hardest job, and he will tell you, if you only have to ask that question, you've never been a university president. So he did it all. And of course, we are very pleased to welcome our special guest tonight, Senator Mitch McConnell, the longest-serving party leader in the history of the U.S. Senate and one of the most consequential leaders of our time. We are so fortunate to have the benefit of his insights at this very moment. And I trust the senator will forgive us for our win over the Wildcats a few weeks ago, although as a Louisville fan, maybe secretly, he may have appreciated it. It is so fitting that these two leaders will be with us here at Vanderbilt to sort through the meaning and implications of Tuesday's elections. As you all know, our university was created in the aftermath of the Civil War to help bring together all the parts of a divided country. Vanderbilt has long been a place where diverse perspectives come together in common purpose and for the common good. And more than 150 years after our founding, we pride ourselves on our distinctive culture of civil discourse, our capacity for listening respectfully to one another, and always keeping an open mind for the better argument. Acting as one Vanderbilt doesn't mean we all have to agree. Quite the contrary. Our debates must be open and wide-ranging, and we can fiercely but respectfully disagree. But we will never lose sight of our common ties. We never lose sight of our common humanity. We never lose sight that we're members of one community dedicated to the same purpose and grounded in the same values. And that tradition, that legacy lives with us today as strongly as it was in the days of our founding. There was a proud moment for me just this past Monday. On the eve of the election, I witnessed our college Republicans and college Democrats engage in thoughtful debate on some of the most contentious issues in America. They picked kind of like an easy set. They picked immigration, abortion, and federal bureaucracy. And I was incredibly proud to see our amazing students embody what makes our campus so unique: the freedom to peacefully discuss, explore, and strive for understanding. At Vanderbilt, We view open discourse and respectful debate as indispensable to our mission. They aren't nice features. They are among our defining attributes. They are essential to learning, discovery, innovation, and a robust democracy. So, thank you all for taking part in this remarkable class, and thank you for your commitment to our university's values. And now, please join me in welcoming Senator McConnell and Senator Alexander.
I am neither Senator Alexander nor Senator McConnell. Thank you all. Senator, thank you for being here.
I'm happy to be here. This football powerhouse has really gotten everybody's
It's happening,
attention.
man. It's happening. There's a lot of news in the country, and that's the big one. That's the big story. I want to also acknowledge Senator Frist and Senator Corker. Senator Frist, who was the Senate Majority Leader, Senator Corker, who had the best job in America and then decided to go to the U.S. Senate. He was the mayor of Chattanooga, Tennessee, which is like being the mayor of Bethlehem. All great things come from Chattanooga, so thank you. And Governor Alexander is going to take off here, but I want to say, I would argue, without much dispute, Senator McConnell is the most important leader of the United States Senate in American history. And that is a clinical observation. President Johnson, Senator Johnson, Lyndon Johnson is often seen as the master of the Senate. But when you look at what LBJ did in the Senate in the 1950s, it was not, I believe, as ultimately significant as what Senator McConnell has done in terms of affecting not only the current moment, but certainly generations, particularly of jurisprudence and constitutional interpretation. And so it's a profound body of work that you have, it's still unfolding, that you've left the country. And so I wanted to say that and then hand this over to my gubernatorial colleague.
Thank you, John, Mitch, ladies and gentlemen. In 1969, I was a very young man working at the Nixon White House, and Senator Howard Baker of Tennessee said to me, "You ought to get to know that smart young legislative assistant for Marlow Cook, who was the new Republican senator from Kentucky." That smart young legislative assistant was Mitch McConnell, and we've known each other ever since and followed parallel paths for a long time. Mitch, I want to start. First, thank you for coming. I mean, you're always busy, but there couldn't be a busier or really more consequential time in your life and in the country's life. We've just had this incredible election. That was only yesterday, I guess. And then next week, there'll be an election for your successor. So the Vanderbilt campus is privileged to have you here. But I'm sure Professor Meacham will get into a lot of issues, and I'll join him when the time comes. But let me start out with some parts of your life that that happened before the age of the students here and during that time. Let's go back to, you were born in 1942. The world had a polio epidemic then, infantile paralysis. Parents were terrified. The President of the United States was disabled by it. People were staying home, and you got polio. Talk about that experience and how it affected your life.
Well, I was pretty young at the time, so most of what I know about that period is what my parents told me. Dad was in Europe fighting the Germans. My mother went to live with her sister, and fortunately, just fortunately, they were an hour's drive from Warm Springs, which was the only place you could go in those days to have some kind of rehabilitative effort. I was an outpatient there, and ironically, one of my visits was the week before Roosevelt passed away there. And it affected my left leg. My first memory in life was the last visit there, where they told my mother that they didn't think I'd have to wear a brace. That's my first memory in life. So we can all speculate about how polio survivors did. Is a recent book out that took a look at other polio survivors, and they've been remarkably successful. I'll give you an example. I had a fraternity brother who was paralyzed from the neck down. Graduated from college, graduated from law school, and when I used to be a local official, I made him a department head, and he had a full life. Imagine dealing with that level of disability.
No one doubts that you are persistent, some might say stubborn, about things you really believe in. Don't you think some of that came from the persistence that your mother showed at a time when you were a toddler and weren't even allowed to walk?
Yeah, let me elaborate a little bit about what they taught my mother. This may or may not have been the right thing, but this is what they thought she ought to do. They gave her an exercise that she was supposed to do 4 times a day. And listen to this, don't let him walk. So here's a 2-year-old to a 4-year-old during that period. Naturally, that's what you want to do, is to begin to walk. So my mother must have watched me like a hawk all day, every day, and like a drill sergeant, administered those exercises.
Move ahead a few years, your dad encouraged you to get into a fist fight. And my observation is, while I've never seen you in a fist fight in the Senate, you don't back down very much. Did that fist fight have any effect on the way you've operated the last 50 years?
It was good practice. What Lamar is talking about, there was a neighbor across the street named Dickie McGrew. Dickie was a year older than I was, and he was much bigger than I was. And he was sort of pushing me around, making me, in today's terminology, he was bullying me. My dad was out working in the yard. He had about enough of it. He called me to come over, and he said, I want you to go across the street and beat him up. I said, Dad, he's older than I am, he's bigger than I am. And my dad said, well, I'm bigger than both of you. So I had to make a choice. To my amazement, I walked across the street, and I did beat him up, and I bent his glasses. And we never had a problem again. And I think that was a good lesson about defending yourself.
You may need that lesson again in a few months.
That's right. In this class, there are bound to be some young men and women who are thinking about public life. Did you really decide you wanted to be a United States Senator when you were in high school?
No, it wasn't until I got to college.
And speaking of college, you were the head of the Young Republicans, right?
I was.
And you invited Barry Goldwater, this was 1964, to come to the University of Louisville.
Yeah.
And then you voted for Lyndon Johnson for president. What about that?
The big issue of that era, as we all know, was civil rights. And I had earlier been pretty much infatuated by Goldwater, and he came to U of L my sophomore year, got to introduce him in the whole bit. But he positioned Republicans. Even though a majority of them voted for it, he positioned Republicans against the Civil Rights Bill. And I was so angry about that I did ultimately vote for LBJ.
Let me ask one more about the early years, and I'll let the professor intervene. You were an intern for Senator John Sherman Cooper of Kentucky, probably in your college years, right?
Yeah.
Would you say to the young people here that it's worthwhile being an intern to a United States senator or to a governor or to someone in public life?
Yeah, it was a great experience. And he was the first famous person I'd ever met, and was exemplary in so many different ways. I mean, great character. The summer I was there, he was working with other Republicans to break the filibuster on the '64 Civil Rights Act, which was an inspiration to me and to a whole lot of others. I went back a year later just to visit him, and I happened to hit it just right. He took me over to the Capitol, and I was in the back of the room, and I got to watch LBJ sign the Voting Rights Act of '65. Just happened. So, you know, if you're an intern, something significant's likely to be going on when you're there.
You also saw Martin Luther King's speech, didn't you?
I did. That was the year before. I was really pretty lucky there. The year before, I was an intern on the House side, and actually was there. I couldn't hear anything because I was down toward the Capitol when Martin Luther King, August 28, 1963, the I Have a Dream speech.
I was an intern for Robert Kennedy then in the Justice Department. And at lunchtime, I wandered out on the mall and I saw hundreds of thousands of people, and I heard the speech too.
I'll be darned, yeah.
You know, the Kennedy Justice Department was so worried that the speakers were going to go off into some sort of communistic rant that they had a switch in the basement of the memorial to cut the mics, and they had a record player ready to start playing Mahalia Jackson over the speakers if they decided that it had gone too far.
I'll be darned.
So it was this tension. So, Senator, there was an election this week. I don't know if you heard that.
I noticed.
You did. You did. What did you make of it? What do you make of it?
Well, I think you have to give President Trump credit. A remarkable comeback. And as we all know, and as your students probably know, only one president in history has come back after losing, and the other one is Grover Cleveland. So we'll see what the second term is like. Well, I was more focused on trying to get the majority back. I've been in this leader job for 18 years. I've been the majority leader, I've been the minority leader. Majority is better.
Write that down, Lamar.
I wanted to turn the job over to the majority leader, and I think that's clearly going to happen now. We just won the Pennsylvania race today, so we'll be at 53. 51 is the magic number. Why is the majority leader so important? The majority leader determines what you're going to do, the agenda. Doesn't guarantee the outcome, but does get to select the agenda, and that's pretty darn important.
How would you say that the Senate has changed since you first came?
John, I won't do this much, but that's worth to talk about why the majority leader is important just for a second. For example, in the time I was there, and I was chairman of the Health and Education Committee. So Senator McConnell would say to me, you may wonder how a bill gets passed, he'd say to me, bring me something that's important for the country and that's bipartisan, and I'll put it on the floor, and I'll try to help you pass it. So, for example, that's not easy to do in the Senate. That means he has to clear the way, create a couple of weeks at least for the Senate to debate it at a time when there's a lot to do. And only one person can do that, and that's the majority leader. So he did that with the 21st Century Cures legislation, which got the country ready for the pandemic. He did it with the Great American Outdoors Act. He did it with other legislation. So
Let me interject on the Great American Outdoors Act. Lamar had a great idea. We had two senators who were running that year who thought the Great American Outdoors Act was a really, really important thing. Lamar said, well, why don't you take them down to see the president and make the argument that he could be Teddy Roosevelt? We took him into the Oval Office, both these guys. They made an impassioned plea and argued to President Trump that this would make him another Teddy Roosevelt. He took the bait, and it was the perfect way to sell it. So that was one of your more significant suggestions.
Well, thanks. But if you hadn't put it on the floor, it wouldn't have happened. One of the senators told me that he said to President Trump, if you pass this law, you'll be the most important conservation president since Teddy Roosevelt. And President Trump leaned back in his chair and said, wouldn't you say, ever?
I appreciate your complimenting your colleague about using flattery with President Trump. That may not be the keenest insight that Governor Alexander has had. How has the Senate changed?
I think there's been a gradual realignment into a conservative party and a more liberal party. When I first got there, and even as late as when you may have gotten there, Lamar, there were still shades of moderation and conservative on the Democratic side. That's pretty much gone now. They've pretty much signed up with the left. We still have some moderates. Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, and several others. I always say there are two kinds of people in politics: those that want to make a point, they're on the Fox shows at night, and those that want to make a difference. And I think most of our members on my side actually do want to have a positive impact. The ones on the evening shows are either running for president or trying to develop a donor base. So it's pretty much hot salsa. But when you get back in the Senate, I do think, and the bipartisan infrastructure bill was an example of that. I participated in it as well. I don't normally go to bill signings with Joe Biden, but I did. And I think it was important to the country. I'd watched the Obama administration struggle to try to come up with an infrastructure package. The Trump administration as well. In fact, my wife is the Secretary of Transportation during the Trump tenure. And it just somehow never happened. And the reason I bring it up is that I thought it was an example of what the Senate used to be more like and could be like again.
You know, President Biden has received some criticism from his party for being nice to you and about you. But that's his Senate. You all shared that. He came in 72, you came in 84, is that right? He was there 2 terms. He was there earlier on. You say you can get back to that. Is it issue specific, do you think, at this point, as opposed to a broader, oh, we can all get along?
Well, I got to know him better when he was vice president than when we were serving together in the Senate. And he was deputized by President Obama to work with me on extending the Bush tax cuts, the deal that we made to try to reduce spending and what was called the fiscal cliff bill at the end of 22. These were all massive pieces of legislation. And so he and I got to know each other pretty well during that period. And ironically, when his son died, I was the only Republican who was at Beau Biden's funeral. So we have a good personal relationship. But I must say, John, I was disappointed that once President Biden was elected, he decided to pursue Bernie Sanders' agenda and was not, in my judgment, in any particular way a moderate.
Well, that's a question for history. I think that, would you agree that the president's basic or temperament was toward not just making a point, but making a difference?
President Biden? Yeah, I do. Yeah. Yeah, I just think he was a reflection of how much to the left the Democratic Party is these days. And I'm not surprised that he found it easier, or maybe he just really felt that way all along. But the reason he ran as a moderate, but of course, if you think about it, if you run against Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, that gave him a lane to run in to get the nomination. What really counted was what he did after he got elected, and I found it pretty far to the left, including even suggesting he might go along with packing the Supreme Court, which is, in my view, completely left.
John, if I could enlarge on that a little bit. Working with Mitch, I think the Vice President Biden was oriented toward getting results. In fact, he joked to me one time that after he made a couple of deals with Mitch, that the Obama White House put him in the witness protection program, and because some of the more ideological members didn't like it. In my own experience, when we were working on, for example, the 21st Century Cures Bill, which Mitch said was the most important bill that passed in that Congress, I would go to Biden to try to get the bill done. And I remember at one time I called him up late in 2016 when it was completely stuck, and I said, Joe, I need some help. I've got the president's precision medicine provision in it. I've got your cancer moonshot. I've got Senator McConnell's money for stem cell research. Paul Ryan has turned somersaults to figure out a budget agreement in a difficult thing. Mitch has agreed to put it on the floor, and I can't get President Obama to return my call. So I feel like the butler standing outside the Oval Office with the order on a platter, and no one will open the door and take the order. He said, if you want to feel like the butler, try being vice president. But he helped, and he was oriented toward results as vice president whenever he could.
Well, Senator, you mentioned the Supreme Court. You, I think, without much argument, single-handedly, it was your leadership that kept President Obama's nomination from going to the floor and in the late stages of his term, very late stages, obviously. And then the more rapid confirmation of Justice Barrett at the end of the Trump term. Would you walk us through your thinking on those decisions?
Yeah. Let me start by explaining my interest in the judiciary. When Lamar and I were there together, we had Nixon sent up 2 Supreme Court nominees, both of whom were defeated. And one of the people I met during that was the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel, a guy named Bill Rehnquist.
Now you're talking about the during the Nixon administration.
Yeah, yeah. fast forward, and those, I even wrote a law journal article arguing that the Congress ought to defer to the president on judicial appointments. But that all began to change with the Bork nomination, the Clarence Thomas nomination, and I worked with Trent Lott and Tom Daschle to avoid filibustering judges. You always could, but it just wasn't done. Once Bush 43 got elected, at the suggestion, interestingly enough, of Chuck Schumer, they began to filibuster judges routinely. And that led to a period of back and forth until we basically ended up back where we were in the beginning, which is you don't filibuster judges. So, to address your question directly, Joe Biden had said in 1992, when he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee and Bush 41 was president, that if a vacancy had occurred during the election year, they would not fill it. Chuck Schumer and Harry Reid had said a year and a half before Bush 43 went out of office, if there was a vacancy, they wouldn't fill it. So I felt totally comfortable about this because what had evolved over all of these years is the Senate is now a co-partner, a full co-partner in picking judges. And both sides are into it. So at the time, I decided not to fill the vacancy. Everybody laughed and said Hillary Clinton's going to be president anyway. So, but I did not feel uncomfortable about doing it because I think the Senate had evolved into treating its role in advising and consenting is almost as important as the nominee being selected. I did, and the only person who got it right was Bob Woodward. I said, you have to go back to 1888 to find the last time a vacancy in the presidential election was filled by a party different from the White House. And that was the difference between 16 and 20. We had the presidency, we had the Senate. And I didn't find that in any way inconsistent with what I had done in 2016, although I was largely ridiculed.
So on the last point, both Justice Kennedy was confirmed in 1988.
The vacancy occurred in 1987.
Okay, so that's the distinction.
Yeah. The vacancy occurring in a presidential election year. The vacancy occurred before the presidential election year.
Would the principle apply on December 31st to January 1st?
I'm sorry?
Is it a calendar question when the vacancy occurs? Because also President Eisenhower also was a
if
Justice
you're looking
Brennan.
for precedent, the precedent was what happens to a vacancy created in a presidential year, and that had not happened since 1888 or 1892.
Well, I think 1956 did with Justice Brennan. Justice Brennan was in 1956, was confirmed by a Democratic Senate.
All I can tell you is my crack staff says that far be it from me to argue with John Meacham.
It's just what I think is remarkable about what you accomplished was you had a majority and you won the elections to have that majority and exercised that power out of principle to make real political, constitutional change. And one of the things that's biographically interesting to me is where you conceived the sense that the court was so critically important that it was worth it? I mean, was it from the early days, Carswell and Haynesworth?
Well, let's take a typical domestic issue. We get elected, we lower taxes, they get elected to raise taxes. If you have the power to have an impact that may last a while, it's lifetime appointments to the court. And I felt very strongly that the Scalia approach, which created the Federalist Society, which is motivated by things like going after the administrative state. Now, what I'm talking about, I would say, particularly the students, is agencies and department heads doing things that Congress never voted for. Congress never voted for. And that was called the Chevron case, Chevron deference. What it meant was the court should defer to agencies and not overrule them. This Supreme Court reversed that a few weeks ago, and I think it was an extremely important decision, a message to us that if you really want to have some particular position carried out, you better put it in the legislation. And even though I know their decision in Roe versus Wade is the one that everybody's talking about, I felt, having interacted with the Federalist Society and these judges over the years, that the motivating factor was going after the administrative state.
Would you talk about your experience on January 6th and then your decision in that second impeachment of President Trump?
Yeah. Well, I think what happened January the 6th, I expressed myself pretty publicly, and I still have the same view. I think your question is, why didn't you impeach after that? There was a very, very serious matter when you impeach the president. A lot of my members who were troubled were comforted by a line of reasoning that you can't impeach somebody who's no longer in office. So it provided an opportunity for people who even were tempted to vote to acquit, and to hope that if there were offenses, they'd be dealt with in the justice system.
You said in that remarkable speech that the incumbent president was practically and morally responsible for what happened. Given where the Supreme Court on the immunity decision, and then given what happened yesterday, would you vote differently today?
I think their decision on the immunity issue was a good decision. As to whether or not all of this stands, it would depend on litigation.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
They didn't say the president could do just anything and have liability protection.
But given what happened yesterday, would you reconsider that vote, your vote?
No, I'm comfortable with where I am.
Let's talk about the next 2 years. You'll, as Lamar pointed out, you have the leadership election. What do you want to focus on?
Well, since we're going to have the White House again, and somebody else is going to be the majority leader, I'll be interested to see what direction this administration takes, which leads me to say, I'm not leaving the Senate. I've got 2 more years at least. What am I going to do?
At least, are you announcing a possible re-election bid here? Can we make some news?
No, I view this period, and Lamar kind of set the tone here. He stepped out of leadership because he wanted to be more free to do what he wanted to do. If you're the leader, whether it's majority or minority, you spend a lot of your time taking arrows and trying to protect your colleagues because you're trying to keep the team together. And at some sacrifice to your own interests. I'm intensely interested and concerned about where we are in the world now. I think this is the most dangerous period since before World War II. We've got members of our party who say, well, why would we spend money in Ukraine? Reagan taught us that you get peace through strength. So let's look at the money for a minute. At the height of World War II, 37% of our gross domestic product was spent on the war. And at least 400,000 people got killed. The Reagan buildup was 6%. What we're spending today is 2.7%. We need to get ready to not just say peace through strength, but to demonstrate peace through strength. And so I'm going to focus on that. I think beating the Russians in Ukraine is the most important thing going on in the world right now. And it's not just a few of us saying that. That's the view of the NATO members. That's the view of the Japanese, the Taiwanese, the South Koreans, the Australians, who started coming to NATO meetings. So basically, this is a contest between the authoritarian world, North Korea, Russia, China, Iran, Iran's proxies, and all the rest of us. And all the rest of us are the democratic countries, and they look to us for leadership. And I had decided that was what I was going to focus on for the next couple of years.
John, if I could, on the Reagan, I think from the student's point of view, it's pretty well known that President Reagan built up, as Mitch said, our national security, spent more money, built more nuclear weapons. But what is often forgotten is why he did it. He did it so that he could get rid of nuclear weapons. I remember talking to him about it. He wanted to rid the world of nuclear weapons. That's what he told me, what he told many, many people. That was not the conventional view at the time. The conventional view was mutual assured destruction. You know, we're all going to have the most we can. You raise some, I'll raise some. His thinking was, I'll build ours up to such a level, and then I'll begin to reduce our nuclear weapons with the hopes that the Soviets will follow. But it's an incomplete understanding of Reagan's buildup if one doesn't remember that his goal was to rid the world of nuclear weapons. He thought they were wrong. And that's a part of his personality people have forgotten. At some point in the next 2 years, let's talk about the filibuster.
That's exciting. Talk about it.
Well, I'm interested to see what Mitch thinks. The filibuster is a much, hopefully in your classes you study de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, which is arguably the best book on democracy in America. And he saw two great, this was the Frenchman who wandered through our country in the 1830s. He saw two great threats to the young democracy. One was Russia, interestingly enough, and one was the tyranny of the majority. The idea that, well, the tyranny of the majority. The filibuster in the Senate is a provision that says that any senator can slow down the train and keep the Senate debating. And if you keep the Senate debating forever, why a bill doesn't pass. So that's why you sometimes hear it said you got to get 60 votes to pass a bill. At Senator Baker's funeral in Huntsville a few years ago, his pastors told the story of how Baker was at a meeting of the session, the elders of the church, and they were arguing over whether to spend $300 painting the church. And Baker sat through the whole thing, and afterwards the preacher said, well, Senator, you're a busy man. He was majority leader at the time. why didn't you just pay the $300 and so you could have that time? He said, because it was important to the members, and I thought it was important that we talk it through until everybody was comfortable with a decision. In my view, the value of the United States Senate is that it's the only institution we have in a very fractured country where requiring 60 votes to pass an important issue forces compromise and consensus and comes up with a result that everybody can live with. Now, presidents don't like that. They want to run over it. Even President Biden said he was for getting rid of this filibuster.
Trump as well.
Trump said he wanted rid of the filibuster. So now we'll have a President Trump. We'll have a Republican Senate that has historically not wanted to get rid of the filibuster. What do you think is going to happen in the next 2 years?
Well, first, with regard to President Trump, do you remember my answer? No. And he said that on a number of occasions, and each time I said no. One of the ways in which I had mentioned earlier, I thought the Democrats had gotten pretty far to the left. It seems to me, if you're willing to break the structure, break the guardrails in order to achieve what you think is important, we saw that on January the 6th. I think breaking the filibuster in order to achieve something that I think is critically important is breaking the rules to achieve what you want to achieve. And I think we need to compete within the guardrails. And Lamar's explanation of the value of the filibuster is entirely correct. One of two things happens. Either a bad idea doesn't go anywhere, or you reach a compromise. And the House is sending bills over to us just one after another after another. Look at the rhetoric. If you ever watch C-SPAN 1, C-SPAN 2, C-SPAN 2 is sort of like watching paint peel. We don't do anything quickly. And that's good, because an awful lot of bad ideas are generated. Many of them pass the House, but they don't go anywhere. And so I think let's leave the guardrails alone, have our debates, but don't try to break the rules to get there. And they tried that 2 years ago. I told Schumer, you should never have had that vote. And now every single Democrat left in the Senate voted to get rid of the filibuster, and every Democrat who ran for the Senate this year took the same position. So I think it's reasonable to assume that the next time they want to, they'll just break the rules.
What would be your advice to your successor? What's the most important thing that a majority leader should know?
Well, whoever that is going to want to try to advance the administration's agenda, and we're not quite sure we know what that is yet. But what I tried to do when I was in a similar experience in the previous administration, Paul Ryan and I both tried to focus on things that we knew there was broad agreement on. Judges, tax reform, which hadn't happened in 30 years. And then there were just other things that swirl around that you try to manage as best you can. You try to convince the president to act in his own best interest. It's a challenging job.
In the best of times.
In the best of times, yeah.
I want to sort of ask both of you, if I may, remarkably engaged, wonderful, amazing students here. Talk about, is it worth being in the public arena, in the elective arena?
Let me tell you a story about someone who's in the audience to answer that question. Bill Frist is here. He was majority leader of the Senate, like Mitch was. Tennessee, I think, is the only state that's had two. We've had Howard Baker and Bill. But in 1994, Bill Frist came to my law office here in Nashville and said he wanted to run for the United States Senate. At the time, he was, if not the leading, one of the 2 or 3 leading heart-lung transplant surgeons in the world.
I think it was the leading, wasn't it, Bill?
I'd say leading.
Yeah.
I said, why would you give up being the leading heart-lung transplant surgeon in the world to do that? He said, well, today, I can fly down to Chattanooga, cut out a heart, put it in ice in an igloo cooler, make sure I get back to Vanderbilt Hospital in 4 hours, do an 8-hour operation, and a year later, I might run into someone on the street who thanks me for saving his or her life. He said, if I'm a senator, maybe I could save 1 million lives. Well, he had no chance to be elected to the Senate, but he ran and won. He became the majority leader, and he worked with President George W. Bush to create PEPFAR, which spent $25 billion and spent $100 billion and saved 25 million lives. So Bill Frist learned that if you really want to make substantial change and unleash the full resources of this country to help the largest number of people, that the best way to do it, or the most reliable way to do it, is to figure out how to get yourself elected to public office or go to work for somebody who has. So I hope there are lots of you who will think about that and think of Bill Frist's example. I can assure you that in the time I was in the Senate and as governor, that I woke up every day thinking I might be able to do something good for my country, and I went to bed most nights thinking that I had. I'd encourage it.
Lamar, could I just add, you don't have to be the leader to have a huge impact. Bob Corker, who's here tonight, was incredible, effective in foreign policy. Lamar has listed some of the things that he focused on that made an enormous difference. The thing about the Senate, the House kind of operates in groups. There's so many of them, they feel like they have to belong to this caucus or that caucus. We mostly don't have caucuses. We have 100 people with different interests, and you're able to have an impact even if you're not controlling the agenda.
Your counsel to students as they set out on, it's a complicated time. I don't know if you think it's more or less complicated than when you were witnessing the March on Washington and the Civil Rights Bill, heading into '68, which was so cataclysmic. Never placid. History is particularly rough today as it unfolds. What is your wisdom of the years to the students?
Well, I've managed to achieve what you wouldn't think anybody could achieve. I'm extraordinarily unpopular. The Democrats hate me because of the Supreme Court. The Republicans don't like me because Donald Trump doesn't like me. And so I'm getting to the lesson here. If you really want to have an impact in a raucous business like Lamar and I were in, I think it's good to be able to take a punch, because to make a difference, to exercise power, to get an outcome, is frequently very controversial. And so one of the things I learned along the way is political popularity is not all that important. Did you make a difference in a positive way in the things that you believe in? So I managed to be popular for two groups with just two, but they're the most important ones, my constituents and my Republican colleagues. What they thought about me in national polls didn't bother me. I never lost a moment's sleep over it. So if you're called to try to have an impact, try to have a big one. And if you do, you might not be popular.
Senator McConnell, thank you, sir. Thank you, Governor Alexander.